Alright, denizens of the Underworlds, we are back with yet another review. I am step by step working through my backlog of reviews here. So I asked my members what they wanted me to tackle next with my quite significant backlog of unreviewed warbands and decks piling on, and the Thorns was the one that piqued their interest the most. So here it is. Also gonna say up front that I have a new mic, which should, at least theoretically, increase the quality of my reviews quite a lot, and also my voiced over battle reports and whatnot. So do enjoy. Let's get through the Thorns review here. The Thorns of the BRIARQUEEN has always been a rather potent warband in the hands of a decent player. And surprisingly, for such a large warband, they also, with their now legended deck, to use AOS lingo, packs quite the punch with 2 fighters sporting 3 damage inspired. And paired with that, they also had quite a few really strong cards that bordered on the overpowered end of the spectrum. With a bit of history in the design of Underworlds, warbands having 2 or more fights with 3 damage was, however, quite common back in the early era of the game. If we look at Shadespire, for example, Magor's had 2 fighters with Riptooth and Magor himself dealing 3 damage. Iron Skulls as well with the Leader and Bonecracker. Chosen Axes had 3 with Fuel on 4, Tefcon 3 and Vol as well on 3, while Steelhearts also bringing 2 fighters with 3 damage with Severin and Oberyn. So yeah, quite a lot of damage early on in the game. But what separated these warbands from the Thorns were their size, and for a 7-man warband to sport not only 3 damage on the Leader and the Lieutenant, but also 4 wounds on both of them and 2 dodge uninspired on both of them as well. This dynamic duo was just a bit much, so it's nice to see that aspect of the warband's strength to have been properly toned down at least. Have they then lost a significant amount of power? I think not. But what I do think is that they've gained strength in a different way, more devious and tricksy, and more fitting of a scheming death warband, and a strength that rewards smart play rather than just brokenly strong cards. Let's take a look. So let's pair up the Leader and Varklav and talk about them. They are still both 4 wounds, and the Queen has kept her 2 dodge uninspired, but Varklav has lost that double dodge uninspired, which I think is fair. They are also brought down to 2 damage inspired, with the Leader able to ramp it up to 3 only with Grievous on a crit. A sensible balance change there as well. Are they just straight up nerfed though? As regulars of the Thorns will know, a big mechanic of this particular warband was, and still is, Varklav the Cruel's, the former prison warden of Shadespire's, ability to push all chain rasps, meaning all fighters except him and the Queen, up to 2 hexes towards the closest enemy fighter. That's quite potent, and it's been overhauled. However, while it's now only 2 chain rasps being pushed maximum, they can now be pushed without restrictions, so not only towards the closest enemy fighter, but just 2 hexes in any way, shape or form. And it is now usable more than once per round, so you can use it basically for all of your 4 activations if you so wish. I think this is in practice a boost, especially if you take into account that you will most likely average losing at least 1 chain rasp per round. You're likely not pushing much more than 2-3 in the second round anyway, and very unlikely more than 2 in the last round. That's not all, however. You may notice the Push, who now also has a name called Solemn March, gives you the option to give the fighters pushed charge tokens. Why on God's green earth would you want to do that, you may ask? And on that note, let's talk about Wave of Terror. But before I forget it, let's also mention that Varklav is now also a wizard, just like the Leader, although only a level 1. The fact that you now sport 2 quite survivable wizards opens up the potential for spell builds to a much greater extent. But anyway, Wave of Terror. This is a passive mechanic all of the fighters share, which means that fighters with 1 or more charge tokens counts as 2 supporting fighters, and this is not restricted to attack or defense, it's just a flat out buff for both those situations. And with so many fighters, you are bound to get a lot of mileage out of this, especially with added abilities to hand out charge tokens like the one from Solemn March. This is definitely not an insignificant effect when used wisely. Let's just briefly look at the chaffs as well, who have, all for the sake of quality of life reasons, which we previously saw with the petitioners, been given individual, if not names, then at least nicknames. We now have the adult film star, I guess, the Everhanged, the Iron Wretch, the Exhumed, the Silenced, and the Uncrowned, the poor soul with his head under his shoulder. This is a welcome change, and so is the streamlined attack profiles uninspired. Most of these aren't here to bring the pain train, so having the smaller ones of these on 2 swords 1 damage across the board uninspired is just something that lets you not mix up attack profiles all the time. I'm surprised they didn't do this for the plebs in Sondara's crew as well. Mixed crappy stats is just a headache when you already have so much to keep in mind. They are just like the leader and Voklov 3 move, and they all inspire to 4 move and go from 1 dodge to 2 dodge, all of them as previously. With the inspire condition across the board being that you have to start your activation next to an enemy fighter, and with an inspire step before you activate now, hard printed, you don't have to do the weird meta condition and then wait for the actual inspire step. So yeah, that's very welcome. Offensively, the only one really to mention here is the Everhanged, who is also the only one of them with 3 wounds, and also the only one who doesn't have the minion keyword out of the non-leader and lieutenant type characters. He has lost some accuracy uninspired, but makes up for it with an interesting little reaction called Throttle, which is also very fitting for the theme of the crew. It's not major, but after your activation step, do note that this is just after your activation step, not this fighter specifically, so this reaction is eligible every time you activate, as long as the Everhanged is adjacent to an enemy. When you trigger it, you roll a magic dice, and on a crit or a channel, so that's 4 out of 6 results, you stagger the fighters you are adjacent to, so the enemy fighters. It's not brokenly strong, but it's still a really nice little buff to break up guard, increase your accuracy, especially with Waves of Terror to boot, and deny enemy fighters the delve. Inspired, he gains cleave and sports a respectable 2 smash 2 damage. All fighters are of course flying as well. And all except the 2 main fighters, as I said, and the Everhanged have the minion trait. Let's move into the deck and see how it has been rebalanced and modernized. Let's check the searches first, and as to not make the video too lengthy, I'm not going to go back and forth between the original cards and the redesigns in every case, as that would just be super tedious. The video will probably be long enough anyway. So let's see what we have to work with. First up, we have Bypass the Guards. It's kind of a staple search for many incorporeal death warbands that you need to move through an opposing fighter. This one is a bit more specific than most though, as you need to end on an objective token specifically. So keep in mind this is for move actions, so yeah, that goes for charge for example, but it doesn't work with Solemn March push. So you can't push through an enemy fighter with that Solemn March to score this one. But on the other hand, this is not bound to activations specifically, so out of sequence move actions, as found in a couple of the universal rival decks, is fine for this as well for a power step search. Their move is fairly low though, so that is kind of what's working against you to score this card. But it's still really solid as far as passive glory goes. Chuck in the chance for out-of-sequence moves to increase the consistency of scoring this card. Deathly Clutches is a search for inspiring 2 at the same time, which is more likely in your initial rounds, so it might be tricky for a later draw. It's nice to have an Inspire step at the start of your activation though, to potentially move through your objective deck even faster with scoring potentially at both ends of a single activation. There's also the option to score this by having 4 friendlies in enemy territory, which takes some setting up, but you can Solemn March spam to make it so, but that condition will be hard pressed to see completion in the later rounds when most of your minions will be out of action. Still, I think the first condition is decent, though your Inspires are very telegraphed, so a push-heavy opponent deck might disrupt it more than I'd like, I guess. I'm a bit so-so on it, honestly, though I have definitely seen worse searches for sure. Distract the Watch is a duel, so there's 2 conditions to adhere to here, but even so, I think this is probably one of the strongest ones here. You need 1 fighter adjacent to an enemy fighter, while 2 other friendlies are on feature tokens. Though it might require some solemn march spam, doing the Varklov special will likely be a significant part of your general game plan anyway, and I think this condition is rather simple to fulfill really. Even later in the game, when many chain rasps are dead, you'll likely have either Varklov or the Queen on a feature token, and then you're basically just a solemn march push away from scoring this card. It's after an activation though, so less flexible in that regard, I guess. Next up is a lofty 2 glory search card. Scores to settle, which is a hybrid for attacking twice successfully with minions, which is honestly a bit meh. Or holding each objective in enemy territory. Weirdly, I think the second condition here is the better option, really, but still it's not great, as even with flipping and reducing the amount of tokens available is kind of depending on the playstyle of your opponent. If you're meeting a turtling hold warband, it's going to be difficult to get them off the objectives, and attacking with the minions seems really untempting, both because they are rather inaccurate and the fact that they're best utilized as kind of push golems and wave of terror buffs for your main hitters. I would probably pass on this card for a serious deck build, but I think in certain games you can get lucky with the second option. Next up is Sorcerer's Syndicate, which is actually a really solid kill search. I mean, kill searches are always a bit so-so and matchup dependent, but since Varklov is now also a wizard, you have 2 eligible fighters for this card, with killing someone with a wizard. And with spell builds, it's even more flexible, as this card does not require you to kill with an attack action specifically. Throat Cutters rounds out the searches with killing an inspired enemy fighter or killing an enemy fighter on a starting hex in enemy territory. This is not very tempting, although not hopeless of course. This one also does not require an attack action kill, so that's nice, but versus aggressive teams or teams that don't inspire that much or very easily, I don't fancy it. And if I can't or have a very situational chance of scoring a card, I generally don't take it. Simple as that. Let's move into the end phases. First one is called Dead Reputation, and it's a hybrid for 2 glory for either each surviving enemy fighter being adjacent to one or more friendly fighter. That's fairly easy versus smaller warbands with the solemn march spam, but if you also want to hold objectives, it might be counterintuitive to other cards and versus larger warbands. Especially early game, I don't think that condition looks very tempting. The other option is that each surviving friendly fighter needs to have at least a move or a charge token. With the option to solemn march spam, it's easy to dish out the charges, but you also need them to move with Varklov and the Queen, and in the first round you might need some token text to make it happen. But out of the 2, I think this is the one to go for if you want to take this card. Later game, when a couple of or 3 of your minions or so have perished, I think this condition looks pretty decent. Might just make the cut, though I'm not over the moon on its circumstances. Even in the later rounds you might already be on the token you want to be on with a couple of these fighters, and the move or a charge can't end up on the hex you started on, so yeah, just keep that in mind, I guess. Next up is Foreboding Inevitability for 2 glory, another hybrid which needs only 1 surviving enemy fighter or a vulnerable enemy leader. This basically reads like a third end phase in practice and is extremely matchup dependent. I pretty much would never take this for a built deck, and keeping a fighter alive with just 1 wound seems like a weird thing to go for. What if that fighter scores the opponent a ton of glory just for staying alive? For you to score this? Just ponder the salty feeling if you left this fighter alive in your last activation and then see that fighter healed up in the following power step, scoring their opponent a ton of glory, and then goes on to become a pivotal fighter in the final round or so. Ouch. Reclaimed Turf is now 2 glory, this time a duel for holding 3 and at least 1 of them in enemy territory or no one's territory. It's not unscorable with the amount of moves push they can pull out and the amount of fighters they have, but it seems a bit harsh for only 2 glory. There's probably better choices in Nemesis and most definitely in Championship. Take This City needs you to hold 1 for 1 glory, so far so good, and 1 glory. End phases should be pretty easy if you're going for them in a decent deck build, whether it's Nemesis or Championship really. But this one is a duel, and you also need to hold every objective in 1 or more territories. Which does include no one's territory though, so it's okay I guess, but larger warbands need to have fat end phases to offset the dying, and this is probably not gonna cut it sadly. These Are Our Streets is more of the same with only 1 glory for not a dirt easy condition. But I mean, still quite doable with holding both an even and an odd valued objective, or having killed a fighter on an objective token in the previous action phase. So yeah, as I said, more of the same. Both these 1 glory objectives are fine, but they are just 1 glory. An elite aggro team can live with 2 or maybe 3 or even 4 end phases for 1 glory. These guys, however, most of the time cannot. Last up is Tide of Death for 2 glory for holding more. Although this is at least slightly matchup dependent, it's still a very solid and fairly reliable 2 glory, and across your rounds you should at least be able to pull this off in one of the rounds. This one I would keep, and this objective is worth just 1 for some warbands. This is, going back to the Reclaimed Turf, though rather weird for a much easier card most of the time, giving an equal amount of glory as that one. But with that said, they desperately needed some solid 2 glory in faction glory here, to have something to complement with in deck builds, especially in the more restricted Nemesis format, so I'll gladly take it. Over to the Ploys and Gambit spells. First up is a rather good card, Back Shanker, which sounds more like a destruction card. But anyway, it's a reaction. Sadly, these ghosts no longer have the search for doing 2 reactions in a round. But anyway, play this during an attack action after the declare attack action step. Choose a friendly minion, so I guess it could potentially be the same fighter, since it doesn't say other. But yeah, has to be a minion. Remove the chosen fighter from the battlefield and place it in an empty hex adjacent to the target, and then if you wish you can give the chosen fighter a charge token. This is a very solid accuracy buff with the Waves of Terror. You could also kill several flies with 1 hit, as we say here in Sweden, while also positioning that minion on an objective, for example, while also working towards the end phases where everyone needs to have a move or a charge. So yeah, awesome, versatile card, very strong, always included. Next up is Endless Malice, which is an old reprint with modernized wording, basically remake the failed attack. Now though it triggers before the defense roll even happens, so if your opponent, for example, has ping reactions to successfully defending rolls or whatnot, they won't proc those, but that's a bit of a niche case anyway. If you build for pure hold, then maybe it's not strictly necessary, but even those builds should pack some counterpunch, if not to kill them, to stave off attacks and drive back your opponents, to protect those precious objective tokens. Grasping Chains is next. This one lasts for the first attack action, so for example if you miss the attack, remake it with the previous Endless Malice, this effect won't stick around, and neither would it for the second attack in a Scything Chain, for example, but alas it makes Chain Rasps counts as 1 extra supporting fighters for that attack. I don't think this is really a warranted inclusion, given how many times you'll have full support anyway. Taking a card to have 1 extra support symbol matter. I think you should use your card slots more wisely than to include this fairly weak effective on a card. Spectral Parries just give a fighter a guard token. Sure, dodge fighters get more bang for their buck with guard tokens than shielded ones, but I think unless you take it to score the earthworks, it's not really strong enough to warrant an inclusion. Spectral Touch is cleave and stagger for the next attack. I would much rather just have a ploy that staggers a fighter ahead of time. I think I wouldn't take this unless I'm going very aggressive, which is probably not the best build for these guys. On that note, with wishing for accuracy leading up to my attacks, this is more like it. Terrifying Advance is very versatile and strong and can be used for more aggressive playstyles and more cagey ones alike. This one lets you choose 2 friendly fighters and stagger each enemy fighter adjacent to those fighters. So say after a solemn march into a horde warband, that could mean a lot of staggers. But the other option is to, if you are not adjacent to enemy fighters with those, or even just one of these fighters, the fighter or fighters not adjacent to enemy fighters instead gets to push. So basically, based on the circumstances, you could stagger enemy fighters with one of the fighters and push the other one, or any combination of the 2. Sorry if that got overly complicated. It's a pretty wild card, very good one, not as good as its predecessor Drifting Advance, but this is still extremely solid. Last of the regular ploys are Unbound Crooks, which chooses a friendly fighter without move or charge, and then places that fighter in no one's territory, and then you can give the chosen fighter a move or charge token. Obviously useful for a lot of things, not least for Fearsome Fortress builds, but also just to blurp out tokens, increase accuracy, hold objectives, or make a surprise appearance with the queen to lay down the pain in the middle of the ground without the need to charge her. And if you move in Varklov to deal damage, if you go for the move token, he can still attack, and he can still use the Solemn March after the fact. Solid card, even if the sudden appearance, I guess it came from, was even more insane. Alright, let's take a look-see on the spells then. First up is Castigating Scream. 1 focus to trigger the effect of Determined Effort, basically, with the added benefit of -1 defense, which versus defensive warbands could be a sweet double nerf, obviously. Is it entirely needed though? For more aggressive builds, it might be, given how much accuracy this team can get from waves of terror, etc. Stacking the odds in your favor even more so could be pretty nasty, and it casts fairly easy. For more turtly builds, I might leave it home though. Sudden Mugging is next. This one does the same as a couple of deploys, or at least very similar. If cast, place a Chain Rasp, and then if they're not adjacent to an enemy fighter, give them a charge token. So you can't gain the Wave of Terror effect from it, but the Chain Rasp chosen might already have one, since this one does not require you to choose a Chain Rasp without the token. It just basically says that you don't get one if you place them adjacent to an enemy fighter. Free teleports obviously has a ton of uses for any warband. Get on an objective token or whatnot, set up support. Last of the Gambit spells here, Torment Lash, yet again 1 focus, and if cast you get to choose from an awesome array of possible effects. So basically you choose another fighter, that could mean friend or foe, but not the caster basically. If it's an enemy, ping that enemy for 1 damage. Keep in mind you need line of sight for spells. If it is a friendly fighter, push that friendly fighter 1 hex, or if it is a friendly Chain Rasp specifically, push the fighter 2 hexes. Amazing. Push or ping. What more to ask for really, and fairly easy to cast as well. I'm generally very impressed with the ploys here. I mean, their previous race of ploys were extremely strong, but the ones that were brokenly good are still in many cases very, very good. Let's check the upgrades. Awful Lear is first. It's a reaction you can use once per round after activating the fighter with this upgrade. Choose a visible enemy within 4. That fighter can't make super actions in the next activation. I think even if you only get to use this card once in a game, that might be very impactful, especially if the enemy has very few fighters left, and the range of the card is very good as well. It is specifically for super actions though, so even if it might not shut down ranged attacks completely, I still would probably always include this card. Next up is Shield Touch, which is really an upgrade I hoped not to see anymore. When will we ever stop seeing cards that only has the effect of Ensnare? Only really useful versus Otapatal, an Inspired Bat Squig or Snurk. Snooze, hard pass for me. Driven by Hatred is next, +1 dice to attack actions while having 1 or more charge tokens. So basically you get the charge token before you attack, just to clear that out. Otherwise this card would be rather situational and quite frankly atrocious. However now it's very solid and it works with every type of range as well, and spell attacks, since it's only bound to attack actions, not attack dice specifically. And you also get the effect for like out of sequence attack even after you have a charge token as well, so yeah, could potentially get a lot of mileage out of the +1 dice there. Enforcer is next, and it doesn't work on minions, so the Everhanged, Valklav, or the Queen is the only eligible fighters for this upgrade. Friendly fighters within 2 can't be driven back. It might seem tempting to slap this one on Valk to buff your whole game, but you'll likely just die on the plebs, not be driven back, so I probably wouldn't take it, to be fair. Grasping Thorns is for the BRIARQUEEN specifically and gives her a reaction, and I believe this one is just a pure reprint from their old card. After attacking successfully with her, you can push the target up to 2 hexes, but the push has to end adjacent to her. It's a bit weird of a push towards yourself after activating. Sure, Waves of Terror buffs your support and defense. I guess it could be usable to push fighters off of objective tokens, but you could do that with the regular drive back as well. I guess if they were guarded, you could still push them, so there is a case to be made, sure. But I would rather have her give the opponent a move token, similar to Ilthari's upgrade, which would make sense from a thematic standpoint with a Thorns here as well. But yeah, I'll pass on this one. Horrifying Malice is -1 dice from enemy attack actions, but only adjacent, and only if the fighter with this card has a charge token. I think range 2 is prevalent enough for this card to be too weak of an effect, and with 7 fighters, none, maybe Valklav I guess, is really unexpendable for this to be really warranted. Merciless Support is not eligible for minions, and while this fighter is within 3 of 1 or more Chain Rasps, you can re-roll Chain Rasps defense rolls. The effect is easy enough to reach, I guess, and with Waves of Terror and double dodge, this could see your survivability rate get pretty decent. I think it's a fairly good card when you factor in those things. Too bad it doesn't help Valklav or the Queen though, so for the most competitive builds it might not make the cut. Shacklegeist Chains is for Volklov, and each time his range 1 or 2 attacks kill someone, you gain an extra glory. I think honestly though, he's not going to be spamming out attacks, he's going to be spamming out Solemn March, so I would probably pass on this one. Plus, he no longer deals 3 damage like he used to, so yeah, pass for me. Spectral Coils is a range 2/3 Fury 1 smash attack with Grievous with the Reform reaction, and yeah, this card is bound to Chain Rasps as well. The reaction, you can hand this upgrade over to another Chain Rasp if this fighter is taken out of action while equipped with this card. I think this card has a couple of things going for it. One, this warband is fairly slow, so range 2 helps with that. Also, it's easier to attack from an objective, fending off attacks without needing to move off of them. And the pass on the upgrade is a really neat little extra something that gives you a lot of more mileage for your 1 spent glory. I'll probably include this one, at least for road testing. Last up is Unliving Overseer, which is also for non-minions with the Drive Minion reaction after this fighter activates. Choose 1 friendly Chain Rasp within 2 and push the Chain Rasp 1x, or that Chain Rasp makes an attack action. But if you choose that option, the card breaks. Even though an out-of-sequence attack with the Everhand could prove vital for a one-off, I think the first option is very, very good for extra mileage on Volklov's Solemn March, for example. That's a really good addition to his action there. I like very much that they've toned down some broken cards and raised the skill level of the warband, I guess. Remains to be seen how strong the Waves of Terror ability really is, but being able to use Volklov's Solemn March ability 4 times while also having quite a solid, well-rounded deck should see these guys perform quite well. As for pairings, there's a lot of options here, but Fearsome Fortress, Paths of Prophecy, Seismic Shock comes to mind. They all seems like really solid options, and there's probably a ton more. So yeah, let me know what your thoughts on the warband is. We have tons of reviews to get through, as well as Winter More lore and other goodies. Stay tuned, and a huge thanks to my awesome members for chiming in and always being a very supportive and good sport. And of course, all your regular subscribers as well. You are the best. Thanks. Bye.